Are you ready for an impossible question? Who is the best Survivor player ever? Not most entertaining or most important, just the best at playing the game. Trust me, it is a hard question, and there are many up for contention. To me, these top players all have arguments for being crowned the best. So let's go through each case and ask the question, are they the best Survivor? I will say this immediately. Tom Westman is my favorite Survivor player. I will tell you there are funnier and more interesting personalities on the show, and players who have changed the game way more than Tom ever did, but Tom's on-screen appearance is just something to behold, and for that reason I think he has such a great shot at being labeled the best Survivor ever. Tom Westman's Palau game is up for contention as the single most dominant Survivor game ever played, and surely the most winningest. In summary, in Survivor Season 10 Palau, after being sent to the Koror tribe, Tom, as the tribe leader, led his team to an unprecedented level of success against the Oolongs. They won every single immunity and left the opposing tribe with just one member. After the one Oolong was absorbed into Koror, Tom continued to control the game, winning 5 immunity necklaces and whittling down his opponents until he won the million. Sure, Tom never got that statistically perfect game, which he does not hold because of one jury vote, but from the standard Survivor pre-merge to merge, very few have truly dominated like Tom. Let's look at easily his most notable strength: physical. If you were to rank Survivors purely off of physical game, Tom Westman in his prime in Palau would be number 1. Firstly, he holds the record along with several other players for most individual immunity challenge wins at 5. These individual challenges were against the same players that had helped destroy Oolong, who were, mind you, significantly younger than Tom. Tom winning 5 against Ian, I think, is especially impressive. I think Ian was of a physical caliber to have been a 5-timer in other seasons, kind of like Tyson, but Tom beat him time after time, even though he was nearly double Ian's age. Besides the 5 immunities, Tom holds some other incredible accomplishments in team challenges. He ties for most overall challenge wins in one season. Tom was not up against a physically weak cast as well. Oolong was younger and at a glance much more athletic than Koror, yet still in head-to-head matches and as a tribal leader, Tom found ways to beat them. He always found opportunities to elevate and motivate his fellow tribemates, and make them feel Koror strong. Before each challenge, when the tribes had the chance to probe some questions about the rules, Tom would ask dozens, finding any way to game the system and earn a victory. When asked why the other team kept winning, Oolong simply said that they have Tom. So in short, a tribe led by a 40-year-old completely destroys a physically capable tribe to an extent never before seen on Survivor, and then said 40-year-old proceeds to tie the record for most immunity wins. There are other 5-timers out there, but they were not as potent of a team challenge player as Tom was, and other players helped completely carry their tribes physically, but they have not won as many individual immunities as Tom. To call him a challenge beast is an understatement. Of course, how dominant is he really? Even though I may be the biggest Westman fan you'll ever hear, even I can admit that there are some asterisks to Tom's staggering challenge records. I think the biggest one is this: how much of the Palau pre-merge was Koror and thus their leader Tom being spectacular, and how much was Oolong being awful? For how many young fit people Oolong had, many of them had never even seen the show. Oolong was Mactor Central. Meanwhile, Koror was filled with people who understood how to survive Survivor. It's not pure coincidence that one of the few Oolongs that was a fan of the show, Stephanie, was also the last woman standing. So yeah, obviously Oolong's own incompetence and bad luck helped to acquire the infamous Worst Tribe Ever title. But still, one just has to look at how hard Koror tried in those challenges to see you also have to partly hand it to them for being such an excellent tribe. And who was the leader of Koror? Who was the one reason, according to Oolong, they didn't win? Tom. In terms of individual challenges, I think it's much easier to defend Tom's superiority. I stand by the Palau post-merge being one of the most physically competitive post-merges ever. Sure, there were challenge duds, and notable challenge performers like Kobe and Stephanie went out relatively early, but the trio of Greg, Ian, and Tom are so stacked I think it makes up for it. And among 2 other great competitors, Tom still got those 5 necklaces. Were they all close? Extremely. Was Ian better at swimming? Yeah, probably. But Tom is still the man who came out on top. I understand if you think there are better team challenge performers out there, and maybe even better individual challenge performers, but even if he's not your number one, Tom will always be in the highest echelon of physical players. Besides, as many nerds on the internet will tell you, challenge ability doesn't even matter that much. Really, it's the social game you gotta focus on. Hey, here's a question. Has there ever been a more admirable career on the show than a post-9/11 New York firefighter? No joke, I think Tom Westman on day one of the island is one of the biggest jury threats to see our screens, and his chances don't go any further down as the season progresses. Fans more well-researched than me have figured out the numbers and put them together to show Tom wins a jury against anyone else from the merge. Considering that the jury section of the game is arguably the most important part of winning Survivor, the fact Tom gets essentially an auto win from just sitting at Final Tribal Council is a huge boon to him. Besides just the jury, it's hard to emphasize how much nearly everyone loved and respected Tom. The Palau cast have called Tom a, quote, hero in every sense of the word, a genuinely good man, Captain America, one of the greatest guys I know. It reminds me of the lauded social games of Kim and JT, yet you never hear nearly as much praise for Westman. Everyone on that island, except for one, was drawn to working with Tom and seeing him as a natural leader. Some have said Survivor is a glorified popularity contest at the end of the day, and there have been few as popular as Tom Westman. Now, he may have been too popular, and a fan who has watched long enough knows maybe one of the more important factors in the social game is not just if people like you and are open to allying with you, it's threat level management. Especially in modern Survivor, convincing others that you are not their biggest competition is a major asset to have. I will say threat management was less of a problem back then than it is now, but I will admit it's still an important asset to have in old school Survivor. And I won't beat around the bush, Tom Westman fails at that. Everyone knows Tom is a threat, without a doubt. He did not hide his target, and Tom himself will be the first to admit that. Before the game, Tom wanted to be the older guy, who no one saw as a physical or social threat. He didn't even want to wear his fireman's t-shirt, as he knew it would just give him unwanted attention as a heroic figure, but production forced him to, and Tom's planned under-the-radar game never materialized because of the threat a seemingly strong and young Oolong team appeared. Tom thought he had to step up and work his ass off to make sure Karor came out on top, and they did. And at the end of the merge, Tom tried to throw those last few challenges. He knew Kobe would never work with him, and wanted to extinguish some opponents on his tribe before the jury phase. But the team he had created just couldn't stop winning. So when Karor absorbed Stephanie, Tom was now left, ironically, with a level of unprecedented success and victory he did not want. He had simply dominated too hard, and I believe with the cards handed to him, he could not play without a massive target on his back. And frankly, with the abilities he had within the era he played, I don't think Tom needed to get the target off. That target was always blocked not just by Tom's immunities. Remember, for the few tribal councils Tom was not immune, this humongous threat received 0 total elimination votes. He survived thanks to maybe his most underrated asset, a stellar strategic game. Sure, Tom is not a sneaky, bombastic strategist. He never needed to flip votes, and Palau aired before the hidden immunity idol. But Tom reminds me of the other masterminds of his era, top-down strategists intent on cleverly keeping the numbers no matter what. Let's look at the layout of Tom's alliances. Westman lay at the center of Karor, along with Ian and Katie, a threesome that has been described as one of the strongest alliances the game has seen. Along with them were a couple of Greg and Jen, forming a tight 5. Tom kept his alliance in check by manipulating them with ideas of honor and loyalty, and with stone cold reason. Ian, Tom, and Greg all knew they were the biggest physical threats, and each used the other as a meat shield. This is why Greg only gunned for Tom as late as possible, because he knew if Westman was out, he'd just become the new Tom. As well as his commanding 5, Tom held on to the pocket vote of Karen, a player on the outs he had fearmongered and brainwashed to the point other tribe members said Karen was obsessed with Tom. So by the merge, Tom had established a web of allies who all checked each other and had reasons in their heads to keep him in the game. Of course, he ruthlessly cut their throats until 6 became 5, 4, and then 3, left with that core alliance. Speaking of this, let's talk about Katie and Ian. Katie is kind of shown throughout the edit as this wishy-washy and disloyal snake, but really her even flipping on Tom and Ian was a truly distant prospect. Even if she did want to flip, it really wasn't possible. At Final 7 and 5, when Katie could have used the girls to flip on the guys, that opportunity was extinguished by Karen, who loved Tom and despised Katie. And at the Final 6, when she could have flipped with Greg and Jen, Tom spooked her at the last minute with the threat of tying the vote and drawing rocks. So whether she wanted to or not, Katie was never going to flip on Tom. And to Ian. Ian is sometimes given credit as the leg that held Tom's game up, the ally he could not have won without. And I don't know if I particularly agree with that. Sure, his leadership and abilities are some of the reasons Karor dominated as it did. Of course, Ian was an ally so loyal to Tom that at the end of the day, he gave up his own shot to win for Westman. But Ian is not the player Tom is. He was indecisive and flipped on his word. He burned bridges with Karen and took Tom on his car reward to let the women's conspire at the beach. These are not traits to have in an incredible ally. So although Ian was essential to how Tom won, he is not why Tom played so well, unlike some other dynamic duos who really needed the other to function effectively. But sure, maybe all of those things are unconvincing as to why Tom is a great strategist. He isn't flashy in Palau. If only he had appeared in a time when flashier moves could be made, with idols and fast gameplay. Oh, except he did, because 5 years later, Tom came back, started out on the bottom, and still survived enough votes to get an idol and in an ingenious move, pull a fast one on one of the most conventionally agreed best strategists the game has ever seen, right after delivering one of the most badass lines this corny reality TV show has ever known.
There you go.
Tomorrow we make our apologies, tonight we make our move.
Okay, to land back in the realm of reality, I know Tom's game in Heroes vs. Villains is not a winning game, and I don't think it ever could have been. That same humongous target from Palau, now made even bigger by his title as a winner, was still there. Meanwhile, he never had any moment to use his social game due to the pre-season alliances made by some of the players before they had set foot on the island. Add on all of that and Tom's body is now 5 years older, and he is one of the most obvious cases of a returnee dead the minute they get on that beach. So to me, the fact he still survived 3 tribal councils and outwitted fellow legend Suri is nothing but impressive. That HVV game does less to tarnish Tom's legacy as much as it does to show how potent he was in Palau. If you want to look at a contender for the best player, look at a man who in his prime was a physical, strategic, and social titan, who in every category and metric he had the chance to prove himself in was nearly no match. Westman is Bestman. I know the praises seemed excessive, and that's kind of the point of this series, to make a case for why this player can be called the best. Don't worry, when I do more of these, I will be fanboying over every player who I think has a shot to be called the best. But Tom might be the hardest I will ever fanboy, because he is my favorite. I mean, really, what other survivor can claim to have led a tribe to complete victory, won 5 immunities, duped Suri, and killed a Shaq?
How's that for a shot?
Oh, and for the end, let's watch what is easily Tom's most legendary achievement. A final immunity challenge against his season-long friend and rival, Ian. An endurance challenge that just involves hanging onto a pole and lasted 12 hours. Tom plays this final challenge like he's played all of Palau. He physically gives it his all in a staggering display of ability. Yet this is still a stiff competition with Ian. Probst tries to goad them into holding on with only 1 foot, but Tom knows the rules of the challenge and won't fall for it. Then after hours of breaking Ian down, getting in his head, guilt-tripping him with his friendship and respect, the Dolphin trainer finally cracks. He steps down and gives Tom the million, a move Ian has said he still does not regret. As Tom wins that challenge, can you say that there has ever been a player quite like Tom Westman?
Wow!
It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen.